Welcome to this talk on installing the rock-solid knowledge SAML component as an identity provider for OpenIddict. My name is Kevin Jones. So this talk is the second of two talks on this topic. In the previous talk, we implemented the service provider. And in this talk, we'll implement the other half of that, the identity provider. And for this, we'll use OpenIddict. So OpenIddict is an open source framework, and it's used to add both OIDC client and OID server support to your applications. Rock-solid knowledge provides a component to add SAML support to OpenIddict, and that's the component we'll use in this talk. So when we use SAML, SAML comes, if you like, in two parts. There's the identity provider, and this is the thing that provides the identity infrastructure. So this is where our user logs in, for example. And this is where we manage user identity and things like authentication. And that's what we'll cover in this talk. The other half of SAML is the service provider. This is the service your user wants to use. And typically, this is an application of some sort, maybe a web application. And really, we can't have one without the other. So the service provider talks to the identity provider to log in our user. In the other half of this talk, we implement the service provider, and in this talk, we'll implement the identity provider. And this identity provider will be used by the service provider we implemented previously. So as I've said, the service provider is part of your web application, whereas the identity provider is implemented in a separate application. And in this case, we'll use the rock-solid knowledge SAML component inside OpenIddict to implement the identity provider. So before we look at the code, I just want to point out that this sample is based on one of the OpenIddict samples. It's based on this Volusia server sample. We've taken that code, we've amended it slightly, and we'll now add the rock-solid knowledge SAML component to that code to make this an IDP. And the easiest way to get a license is to go to OpenIddictComponents.com. If you enter your information here and an email address, then we'll email you a demo license. So I've already done that. I'll use that license in this code. So to add SAML support to this server is a multi-step process. So if I go into my server code and look at startup.cs, then it's in here that we're going to add the configuration for our SAML service. If we notice in here, I have a couple of things that I'll use in a moment. I'm getting the connection string for my database from my configuration file. I've also put my product license key and the name of the licensee in the configuration file as well. This is the key I've just got from the IdentityServer.com website. And also in here, we'll be using MySQL. And for the MySQL driver, I need to know the server version. So we call this server version.autodetect function, and that gives you back the version of MySQL server that we are using. And we'll use that in a moment. So the first thing I want to do is to add some DB contexts. So inside startup.cs, we call this add server function. And it's inside add server that we configure OpenIddict. And the function this calls is passed an OpenIddict server builder object. And I use that object to configure my SAML component. So after the call to use ASP.NET Core, I can configure the DB context that I need for SAML. Now, before I do this, I need to add the correct NuGet packages. So if I open up NuGet, I want the RSK.SAML.OpenIddict packages. So if I add RSK.SAML.OpenIddict ASP.NET Core.identity to my IDP, and also add RSK.SAML OpenIddict.entity framework core to my IDP. Notice that when I do that, then the RSK.SAML.OpenIddict package is added implicitly for me. So with those packages in place, I can now configure my server. To do that, I take my options object and call options.add.SAML plugin. This takes an OpenIddict SAML builder to allow me to configure the plugin. So the SAML plugin uses 3 DB contexts, and I add those here. Now, I could add those individually, but we also have a single API to add all 3. So to do that, I call builder.useSAML entity framework core, and on this I call add SAML DB contexts. This takes an action, and that action takes an options. So we have options goes to, and then in the body of this Lambda, we configure our database access. We tell it which database server we're using. In this case, I'm using MySQL. And for MySQL, we have to pass in 3 values. We pass in the connection string that we saw earlier. We pass in the server version that we also saw earlier. And then we have to tell it which assembly to use for its migrations. That's another action. That also takes an options. And let's call this one SQL options. And we can say SQL options goes to, and then inside this action, specify the assembly. And we do that by saying SQL options.migrationsassembly, and we give it the name of the assembly. And I have a variable called migrationsassembly that's set to that name. And if I browse and look at this variable, then we've set that here. We use type of startup.assembly.getName.name. So it's the name of this assembly. So to finish off this configuration, back inside the add SAML plugin, I take my builder object and call this configure SAML OpenIddict server options API. Again, this takes an action, and this time let's call the options to this server options. And inside this, we are going to configure the IDP. And there are 2 parts to this. So I say server options.idp options first of all. And to this I assign a new SAML IDP options. And inside here I set my license information. So I set the licensee to the value I grabbed above, and I set the license key also to the value that I grabbed above. After that, I create a host options. And that's also an object. And that's this SAML host user interactions object. And into this, I'm going to pass 2 URLs. I pass the login URL. We are using ASP.NET Identity to login. So this login URL is the standard URL for ASP.NET Identity, which is /identity/account/login. The logout URL is a URL that we provide. And in this case, that's called connect/logout. This URL is on this controller, the authorization controller. And if I scroll down, we'll find these 2 actions associated with logout, one with an HTTP GET, just to return the view for logout, and one with an HTTP POST, which will actually use the sign-in manager from ASP.NET Identity to do the logout for us. So I'm almost done with configuring the plugin. There's one more thing we have to do. We have to tell the plugin which type we are using as the identity. So for that, I call SAML ASP.NET Identity, and I tell it the identity type. This is a type defined in the application, and if I browse to this, we can just see that application user derives from identity user. So now that we've configured the plugin, we have to tell the application to use it. And we do that inside the call to configure. And it's before we call use authentication and use authorization. So we say app.use OpenIddict SAML plugin. And that will now add the plugin to the pipeline for us. So with all of that in place, we can now create the migrations and then run them to update the database. So I'm using MySQL here. And inside MySQL, I've created a schema called OpenIddict. So I'm going to create the migrations and then run them against that schema. So we need to create 4 sets of migrations and then run each of those migrations. So the first set we'll run, we'll use the application DB context. So this is for ASP.NET Identity. And then we create the 3 migrations associated with this SAML plugin. There's the OpenIddict SAML message DB context. There's the SAML configuration DB context, and then the SAML artifact DB context. So with all of those migrations created, I can then run them to update the database. So first of all, the application DB context, the OpenIddict SAML message DB context, the SAML configuration DB context, and the SAML artifact DB context. Now with that in place, there's one more thing I'd like to do before we use the application, and that's to seed the database. So back in the application code, I have a file called worker.cs. And worker.cs implements iHosted service, and we'll use the hosted service API to run this code. What this code will do is to create a client in my database, and it will create this client. And this is identified via the localhost 5001/SAML client ID. And if you watch the talk on the service provider, that's the entity ID we use in the service provider. We create a user, and that user has a username of bob@test.fake and an email of bob@test.fake, and we'll use that user to log in. And then here we provide a new service provider. And this again matches up with the service provider we created in the previous talk. And note again, the entity ID is the same. So to use this worker.cs, back in my startup code where I configure my OpenIddict service, I call services.addHostedService. And the hosted service we are adding is this worker service. So that service will run at startup, and when it runs, it will initialize the database. So with all of that in place, with migrations having run, I can now run this IDP. Once the IDP has started, I can run my service provider, and that service provider looks like this. On the service provider, the details URL is protected with the authorize attribute. So to get at these details, I have to first log in. Now notice at the moment, we are running on a server on localhost port 5001. When I click on details, that's going to use SAML to log me in. So let's try that. And this is now taking me off to the IDP. And notice now we are running on localhost 5003. And we're using the identity/account/login URL that we configured for this IDP. If I type in the username, which if you remember is bob@test.fake, and the password is password123 ! with a capital P. If I click on login, that takes me back to the SP. So we are back on port 5001. We're in the home details endpoint, and all this page does is lists out the set of claims for this user. But the service provider has now connected to the identity provider that we've just coded to do our SAML login. So just to recap, back in the identity provider, inside the call to add server, we configure our plugin. So we call add SAML plugin. Inside there, we configure the DB context this plugin uses, and we configure the options for the plugin. We set things like the license key and the licensee, we set the login URL, and we set the logout URL. We set up the identity type we are using in this application by calling add SAML ASP.NET identity. We use hosted service just to initialize the database. And then finally in the call to configure, we call use OpenIddict SAML plugin to make sure the SAML plugin is in the pipeline. So across these two talks, we've written an SP and an IDP on OpenIddict using the rock solid knowledge SAML plugin. The code for both the IDP and the SP can be found on GitHub at https://kevinrjones/OpenIddict-RSK-SAML. And I hope you found both of these talks useful.